little deeper into the Insidious universe. Let's do it. Today, we're going to be diving into Insidious Chapter 3. And you know what? You might be surprised that we're taking on a horror flick for this. But this one is more than just jump scares, believe me.
Yeah, this one really gets under your skin.
It does.
Yeah.
Especially because it's a prequel, right? We're going back to the beginning. And that means we get the backstory of Elise Rainier, which is amazing.
And we see how this whole haunting world of the further really starts to take shape. And it all begins with a pretty simple but terrifying idea: grief. Like, what if our deepest sorrows could actually open a door to something dark and dangerous?
Okay, so for those who haven't seen it, Insidious. Chapter 3 takes us back to a time before Elise was the confident, take-no-prisoners, spirit-banishing badass that we see in the first two films.
Right. She's not quite there yet.
No.
In this one, she's still dealing with her own demons, her own haunting past. So when she meets Quinn, this teenager who's desperate to connect with her dead mother, Elise's reluctance to help, it makes total sense.
Yeah, her hesitation feels so real because of everything she's already been through.
Exactly. And Quinn, she's just so vulnerable, right? You've got this teenage girl, heartbroken, reaching out to the other side. And it's that raw grief, that need, that makes her a beacon for something sinister lurking in the further, something truly terrifying.
And that's where we meet the man who can't breathe. Just saying the name sends shivers down my spine.
Oh, he is the stuff of nightmares.
But, you mentioned something interesting earlier, that the film isn't just about external scares, those jump out and grab you moments. It's about how Quinn's internal struggles, her grief, they actually manifest in the further. Am I right?
You're spot on. Think about it. Quinn's in a terrible accident that leaves her with 2 broken legs. On the surface, it's a physical injury. But the film uses those broken legs, that inability to move, to symbolize her trapped emotional state. She's stuck, unable to move on, much like how grief can make us feel paralyzed.
Oh, wow. That's a really powerful visual metaphor. The film's telling us we've all felt that sense of being held back, of being stuck.
Exactly. It makes Quinn's terror relatable, even if most of us haven't encountered a creature from the further.
Thankfully, right. But it's not just Quinn dealing with this kind of internal-external horror connection. We see Elise battling her own demons too, right? She's still haunted by her past encounter with the bride in black. It's like this unresolved fear, this trauma, that makes her hesitant to even use her gifts.
Exactly, and that's what makes her arc in this film so compelling. We see how much pain she's in, but she still chooses to face her fears. She chooses to help Quinn.
It's a real testament to her strength, Seeing her like this, so vulnerable, makes her later transformation even more powerful.
Absolutely, and that empathy she feels for Quinn, it's crucial, because in a way, she sees herself in this young girl, right? They've both experienced this profound loss.
It's like their shared grief, that common ground, is what ultimately brings them together. So we've got these two characters both wrestling with their own darkness, and then there's this terrifying entity, the man who can't breathe, who's drawn to their vulnerability. But what exactly is the further? How do we even begin to understand this realm?
It's tricky because the further exists outside the rules of our world. Imagine a realm where time and space are fluid, where our deepest fears, our darkest memories, they don't just stay buried, they take on terrifying physical forms.
Ooh.
That's the further. It's not just a spooky location, it's a reflection, a manifestation of the character's internal states.
Okay, so when Quinn's apartment becomes twisted and distorted in the further, that's not just random horror set design.
Not at all. It's a visual representation of her broken emotional state. Her fear, her grief, it's all there. The further becomes this nightmarish landscape, tailored to her specific terror.
That's some seriously creepy, personalized horror. No wonder Insidious.
Yeah.
Chapter 3 gets under people's skin so effectively. It's those personal anxieties, the fears we try to keep hidden, that the film really brings to the surface.
Absolutely. And what's so effective about Chapter 3 is how it blends that psychological horror with more visceral scares, creating this atmosphere of dread that frankly stays with you long after the credits roll.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of things that stick with you, let's talk about the filmmaking itself, because Chapter 3 is a masterclass in using sound and visuals to create a truly unsettling atmosphere.
Oh, for sure. One of the things that struck me was how Leigh Whannell, the director, uses darkness and light. It's not about cheap jump scares, it's about framing, about leaving certain areas of the screen obscured, making us anticipate what might be lurking just out of sight.
It's like he understands that what we don't see can be even more terrifying than what we do see, right? Like our imaginations run wild.
Precisely. And then there's the sound design.
Oh, man. Don't even get me started.
That rasping breath we talked about earlier, it's not just a sound effect, it becomes a character. This constant, unsettling reminder that the man who can't breathe is always lurking, even when we can't see him.
It's brilliant because it plays on that primal fear of the unknown, that something is out there, but we don't know where it is or when it will strike.
Exactly. And it's those subtle touches, those masterful uses of sound and visuals that make this such an immersive and unsettling experience. It's no wonder Chapter 3 is considered one of the most effective horror movies in recent years.
Totally agree. It's a slow burn, for sure, but the payoff, it's worth it. But before we get totally lost in the darkness, let's talk about the characters a bit more. We've touched on Quinn and Elise, but what about everyone else? How does the supporting cast add to the film's overall impact?
Well, there's Quinn's dad, Sean. He's trying to cope with the loss of his wife, all while trying to understand his daughter's increasingly disturbing behavior. He's caught between the everyday world and this terrifying supernatural reality, and it's heartbreaking to watch.
Absolutely. It shows how this family, already broken by grief, is further tested by what happens next. It adds this whole other layer of emotional depth to the film.
And then, of course, we have the introduction of Specs and Tucker. You know, those paranormal enthusiasts who become so important to Elise later on.
Oh yeah, this is where we first meet them, right? And their dynamic with Elise, it's hilarious. They bring some much-needed comic relief to all this darkness. But they also serve a bigger purpose, don't they?
Absolutely. They're like the audience surrogates in a way. Skeptical at first, then terrified, and finally drawn into this world of the supernatural.
That's a great point. They're funny and relatable, but they also highlight that human curiosity, that pull towards the unknown, even when it's dangerous.
Precisely. And it's that blend of humor, horror, and genuine character moments that makes Insidious, Chapter 3, such a fascinating film to dissect.
It's not just a horror movie. It's a story about grief, loss, and the power of the human spirit to overcome incredible darkness.
Exactly. And on that note, let's dive a little deeper into those themes because Insidious, Chapter 3, explores some really heavy emotional territory in a really effective way. You know, one of the things that Insidious Chapter 3 really brings home is how grief, it can be like this open wound, you know, leaving us vulnerable to things that we just don't understand. It's not just missing someone, right? It's that deep, almost visceral need to connect, and that can really cloud our judgment, make us susceptible to dangerous forces, things we wouldn't normally even consider.
Yeah, it's like grief itself becomes a kind of haunting.
Yeah.
You know, distorting how we see things, making it hard to tell what's real and what's not.
Exactly. And the film shows us how that vulnerability can play out in different ways. Like, we see it with Quinn, so desperate to reach her mom that she's blind to the true nature of what she's inviting in. And then there's Elise, right? Still haunted by her own past, afraid to use her gifts because of what happened before.
Both of them, trapped in a way, held back by their grief and fear. But what's so powerful about the film is that it doesn't leave them there. It offers this message of hope, of empowerment. It's not about giving in, but finding the strength to confront those fears head on.
Yes, exactly. Look at Quinn's journey. I mean, she is physically and emotionally vulnerable, hunted by this terrifying entity, but she never gives up hope. She's looking for a way out of that darkness always.
And Elise, too. She could easily stay withdrawn, let fear control her, but she makes a different choice. She chooses to confront her past, to use her abilities to help Quinn. It's incredible.
It's a powerful message, isn't it? Even when we feel broken, we still have that strength inside us. And sometimes it's helping others, seeing that shared pain that helps us tap into it.
It really is. It's one of the things that makes Insidious Chapter 3 more than just a typical horror movie. It's not just about scaring us. It's about showing how resilient the human spirit can be, even when faced with unimaginable darkness.
And speaking of darkness, let's talk more about The Further, because the film doesn't just use it as a backdrop for scares, it actually builds on its mythology, giving us a deeper understanding of what it is, how it connects to these characters.
Okay, so for someone who's new to Insidious, how would you describe The Further? What makes it so significant?
Imagine a realm where the rules we know, time, space, they don't apply. Where everything we fear, all our deepest, darkest memories, they take on physical forms. It's a twisted reflection of our subconscious, and trust me, you do not want to get lost there.
It's like stepping into a nightmare, but you can't wake up.
Exactly. And what makes The Further so scary is that it's not just some random haunted house. It's connected to the characters' emotions, their inner states. Like Quinn's apartment, remember how it changes in The Further?
Yeah, how could I forget that? It's like her grief and fear actually warped the environment, turned her home into this terrifying funhouse mirror of her own internal struggle.
Precisely, it's personalized horror. And then there's Elise. For her, it's like a battleground, the place where she has to confront the things that have haunted her, reclaim her power.
So it's interesting. Further serves different purposes for these characters, right? For Quinn, it's like a manifestation of her vulnerability, this desperate need to reach her mom. For Elise, it's where her past traumas quite literally come back to haunt her.
And for the audience, it taps into those primal fears we all have about what's out there, what happens after we die, the possibility that those fears might not be so irrational after all.
It's a chilling thought. What if the things that scare us the most aren't out there in the dark, but already inside us, just waiting for the right moment to come out?
Oh, that's a scary thought. And it's a big part of why Insidious. Chapter 3 works so well as horror. It blurs the lines between what's supernatural and what's psychological, makes us confront the darkness inside and out.
Speaking of darkness, we have to talk about the man who can't breathe. He really embodies those fears in this film. What is it about him that's so terrifying, even in a universe that's already filled with terrifying creatures?
I think it's because he embodies those deep-seated fears we have about death, about decay, that gaunt appearance, that raspy breathing, the way he seems to drain the life out of his victims. He's a walking, talking symbol of mortality. It's those things we just don't want to think about.
You're right. And yet there's also this tragic, almost human element to him, especially when we get that glimpse into his backstory. We see him as a young boy already dealing with illness, isolation, despair. It adds a whole other layer to his character.
Oh, absolutely. It reminds us that monsters, they aren't born that way. They're created. With the man who can't breathe, we're seeing the devastating effects of pain left to fester. It's grief and trauma unchecked, twisted into something monstrous.
It's like the film is saying that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't lurking in the shadows. They come from within, from those darkest parts of ourselves.
Exactly. And that's a recurring theme in Insidious Chapter 3, isn't it? It's not enough to just fight external demons. We have to confront those internal ones too, those fears and insecurities that can keep us from really living.
It's about recognizing that true strength comes from acknowledging those vulnerabilities, from finding the courage to keep moving forward, even when everything seems dark and hopeless.
And that message, that resilience, that belief in the strength of the human spirit is what makes Insidious. Chapter 3 more than just a horror film. It's about overcoming any challenge, no matter how terrifying.
You're right. So we've talked about the creatures, the emotional depth, the deeper themes that make this film so compelling. But let's not forget the technical side of things, right? From the sound design to those practical effects, Chapter 3 is a visual and auditory experience, even if it does come with a few nightmares.
Oh, for sure. Right from the start, I was struck by how Lee Wannell, the director, uses darkness and light to build suspense. It's not about jump scares, it's about how he uses shadows, silhouettes, glimpses of movement to keep you on edge.
Every shot feels heavy with dread, like something terrifying could just emerge from the shadows at any second.
Exactly. He knows that what we don't see is often scarier, and he uses that to his advantage. It creates this atmosphere of suspense that's almost unbearable at times.
It's like he's playing with our fears, making us question every sound, every flicker of light.
And then, of course, there's the sound design. Joseph Bishara did the score, and it's masterful, this terrifying but strangely beautiful soundscape. He doesn't rely on cheap jump scares either. It's all about subtle cues, whispers, creaks, that unforgettable rasping breath of the man who can't breathe. It gets under your skin.
It's true. There's something about good sound design in a horror film, those small touches that just burrow into your mind and stay with you long after the movie's over.
Absolutely. And speaking of things that linger, let's talk about the practical effects. And in a time when everything's CGI, it's refreshing to see a film that uses makeup, prosthetics, good old-fashioned ingenuity to bring those monsters to life.
It's really effective, too. There's something raw, visceral about practical effects that CGI can't quite capture, like the makeup for the man who can't breathe. It's terrifying, but also tragic. It really brings across that sense of decay, but also hints at the humanity beneath.
It's clear that a lot of care went into creating those visuals, and that makes them all the more unsettling. It's not about just looking scary, it's about feeling real, tangible, like something that could exist right outside our field of vision.
That's what Insidious Chapter 3 does so well. It blurs those lines between what's real and what's a nightmare. Reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we create ourselves.
And on that note, let's shift gears a little and talk about how Chapter 3 builds on the Insidious universe, sets the stage for what comes next. We've mentioned Specs and Tucker, but there's a lot more to unpack about how this film lays the groundwork for the entire franchise.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how it develops Elise's character. We see her at a crossroads here, struggling with her past, hesitant to step into her power.
It's a smart move by the filmmakers because by showing us this more vulnerable, unsure side of Elise, her eventual transformation into this fearless, spirit-battling powerhouse is even more powerful.
It's like a hero's origin story, right? We see her at her lowest point, and then we watch her rise from the ashes, stronger than ever.
Exactly. And her connection with Specs and Tucker, that's crucial too. It's not just comic relief. It's about giving Elise a support system, a team who believes in her, who will stand by her.
It's the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and it continues to entertain us throughout the franchise. But it's more than that, right? It's about the importance of connection, even when facing extraordinary circumstances.
Right. Even when things are terrifying, we don't have to face them alone. There's strength in numbers, in finding people who get you, who share your curiosity, even when it leads to dangerous places.
And it's that shared purpose that drives Elise, Specs, and Tucker to keep going. It makes them want to learn more about the further, even when it's risky, even when the answers are hard to find.
And it's that same curiosity, that desire to understand what scares us, that keeps audiences coming back to the Insidious films. Because deep down, we're all drawn to the unknown, to what we don't understand. It's like we want to believe there's more out there, and we'll face our fears to find it.
It's what makes horror such a compelling genre. And Insidious, Chapter 3, it explores those fears, but also those human themes of grief, trauma, and resilience in a way that few horror films can match.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when we're facing unimaginable things, there's always hope. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply ask for help.
It's true. You know, there's something about that idea that there's this whole other world right there, but hidden from us.
Yeah.
Scary. Yeah, but also kind of exciting, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's that push and pull, that fascination with the unknown, even when it terrifies us. And Chapter 3 really gets that. It's horror, sure, but it's also about that very human need to understand the things that scare us, even maybe especially when those things come from within.
Which, speaking of scary things, we should probably talk about how Insidious Chapter 3 was received. How did this prequel, with its focus on Elise and the further, go over with critics?
Well, you know, horror sequels, especially prequels, they're tough. You're always going to be compared to the original, and critics, well, let's just say they don't always go easy.
No, they definitely don't. Horror fans are a passionate bunch. They know what they like. So what did they think of Chapter 3?
It was interesting. A bit of a mixed bag, really. Some critics felt it wasn't quite as scary as the first Insidious. Thought the pacing was maybe a little slow in parts. But, and this is important, a lot of them really praised the film's heart, you know? Its exploration of those deeper themes of grief, trauma, and how we cope with loss. And pretty much everyone agreed that Lin Shaye, as always, was phenomenal as Elise.
Yeah, she owns that role. Lin Shaye is Elise. There's just this incredible mix of vulnerability and steeliness that she brings to the character.
Yeah.
Makes her so believable, so compelling.
Exactly. And I think Chapter 3 gives her a lot to work with. We see the toll her abilities have taken, how much her past still haunts her, but she doesn't give up. She confronts those demons, embraces her power. It's what makes her the force she becomes in the later films.
Such a great arc for her character.
Yeah.
But even putting Elise aside for a second, what do you think really connected with people who saw this film, even those who maybe weren't already familiar with Insidious?
I think it's those universal themes, you know?
Yeah.
Grief, loss, the resilience of the human spirit. Yeah, it's horror, but it's also about facing your demons, finding the strength to keep going when things are tough. And those are things everyone can relate to.
Exactly. It's that human element, that emotional core, that makes Chapter 3 more than just a scary movie. It sticks with you. It makes you think about your own fears, your own experiences.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, that's what makes it such a strong entry in the Insidious franchise. It adds to the mythology, sure, but it also adds depth to the characters and what drives them.
Well said. So, as we come to the end of this deep dive into Insidious, Chapter 3, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from it? What's that final thought you want to leave them with?
That's a good question. You know, I think the biggest takeaway is that fear, just like grief, is a part of life. It's normal to be afraid, to acknowledge it, to seek help when we need it. But we don't have to let fear control us. Like Elise and Quinn, we have the strength to confront our fears, to be vulnerable, to recognize that we don't have to face the darkness alone.
Really powerful stuff, and a perfect note to end on. So, to all our listeners out there, remember, next time you feel that shiver down your spine, that sense of something lurking just out of sight, don't shy away from it. Lean in, explore it, and never forget you don't have to do it alone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Insidious Chapter 3. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop diving.